Here's a model of thinking that tries to capture this very complex process of thinking into something that we can get our heads around in a practical context. You may notice the 4 categories in red: analysis, compare, contrast, inference, interpretation, evaluation. They're essentially 4 main types of thinking that we can say are involved in critical thinking. The green one, generating possibilities, well, it gives it away, creative thinking. The one in the middle, you may be less familiar with. That's metacognition, which is a distinct human capability to actually reflect not just on our thinking, but our emotions, our beliefs. It's the center of self-regulation, and as we'll see, massively important in learning. And you'll see that this is one of the things that we need to spend more time on developing in our students, because if they can think well and are metacognitive, that's a big learning benefit. So let's go through these in a bit more detail. Generating possibilities. Let's do the creative thinking first. It's pretty easy, but it's difficult in practice. We generate many possibilities, different types of, but this is the big one, isn't it? That can we actually come up with novel possibilities that are useful in practice? That's where the big bucks are. Let's move on to critical thinking. A key aspect of critical thinking is the ability to do good analysis. And if you are an engineer in particular, but not just engineering, you'll be very familiar with these things, that we understand how systems work, parts in the system, functions of parts, the relationships between parts, and the consequences if a part is missing, and how these things form subsystems and whole systems. And outside of engineering, certainly in the area of psychology, that we have situations where parts have a synergistic effect. Classic example is team working. The team, or an effective team, is more than the sum of the parts. Compare and contrast, well, we do this all the time. We're always comparing and contrasting, which means we look for similarities, the differences, well, what's significant about the difference. You may be choosing a new phone. A lot's going to be the same, but something might be different, and that difference may be most important to you and the situation that you're in. So that's what we do when we compare and contrast. Inference and interpretation is about pulling things together. It's about getting the big picture. And perhaps it's the more challenging thing to teach, as we'll see a bit later, because there's a lot to it. We need people to understand that when we say things, that there's often intentions and assumptions in what's said, and particularly in data. So that involves separating fact from opinion, making connections, identifying key points, contradictions in data, and building up a big picture, making meaning of it. It's connecting things together. Remember, in thinking that builds understanding. So ultimately, we have the best picture to make predictions. More we know about something, more predictive can we draw our inferences and interpretations from that about future events. Evaluation, well, we've all done that. Sometimes we do it well and sometimes we don't, and there's reasons for that. Okay, we want to evaluate something, so we decide on it. Now, coming up with a criteria that's important. We often may come up with criteria that when we reflect back on, when we're metacognitive, we say, wow, that wasn't so important. We've missed a real biggie out. And with our criteria, it's about prioritization. When my wife goes shopping, cost doesn't seem to be the priority. When I go, it does seem to be the priority. So we apply criteria when we make our decisions. So that's critical thinking, the components of it, the types of thinking, and these work dynamically, synergistically. Metacognition. Let's spend a little bit more time on this because this might be less familiar to some of you. First of all, as human beings, we can be aware that we can think in an organized manner, and we may also, or should be aware, that there's barriers to our thinking, which we will look at later in the tutorial. But not just being aware, but we must actively think about our thinking and things that may be affecting our thinking and what we're going to do about it. And that's why monitoring and evaluating how effective we're thinking is an important aspect And perhaps that's where the real results or benefits of metacognition come into play, because it will involve understanding our emotions, our beliefs, and how these may be impacting the thinking process. And as we go through this metacognitive process, we're trying to think better. We're trying to do other types of thinking better. And we're always looking for useful learning strategies, tools, and resources to make our capability more effective. And that's what learning and building capability is all around. Getting new knowledge, skills, building on it. Here's a nice cartoon. You can look at it yourself, but what you'll notice is a student who is certainly doing a bit of metacognition. And wouldn't it be nice if more of our students did this? And what's important is this kind of swirl of thinking, this process of processing information, making connections, and trying to keep a good metacognitive state is both a conscious activity, but also a sub and unconscious one. It's a bit of a messy process, but we're beginning to get a reasonably good understanding of it now, and how to translate that into the way we teach to develop the capability in our students.